I'd been in the Foreign Office for a couple of years when 9/11 happened, and I think for anyone who had that, comes from that generation, it then sort of shaped my professional life for the next few years. I was in Iraq during the war, and I was in Yemen, Afghanistan, and so on. And I think when you're working in those environments, you don't have much chance to think about what's really happening because there's so much chaos and crisis in front of you. And it was only really afterwards that you tried to sort of re-examine your experiences that I realized that there was a thing that we never talked about that was there always, and that was the climate crisis, the gradual shifting of the climate. And I write in a book, right as early as I think 1999, 2000, I was in the Sahel region, so that's, you know, the bit of Africa just south of the Sahara Desert. And already there you were seeing conflicts playing out that were resulting from the shifting climate, people's sort of livelihoods, particularly farmers, finding they couldn't continue to farm in particular areas, and populations moving as a result. So I think it was that thing that this thing, the climate crisis, has been affecting geopolitics for the last few decades, but we haven't looked at it in that way. We go on about religion or politics or economics, and actually there's this thing underneath it.
Yeah, and it's kind of unpicking where those things are interwoven and what's clear about them. And the conflict that you just mentioned, I mean, that was seen through the lens of kind of ethnic conflict and politics. But what in that specific instance was the kind of climate that was driving the conflict there?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at the Sahel region, there's a few things that are going on there. One is it's very rapidly growing population, and you, as I mentioned, you have people who whose livelihood is through farming, agriculturalists, but also pastoralists, so people who are effectively nomadic and move their herds through a very wide area.
And that's, just to clarify, that's North Africa, right? That's Chad, Niger.
Yeah, so we're talking the strip of territory underneath the Sahara Desert, which goes from the Atlantic Ocean, countries like Senegal, Mauritania, and so on, all the way across to the Red Sea, Sudan. And actually, in that band of territory, every single country in a sort of 2-year period, just in the past 5 years, had a military coup or a sort of breakdown of government. So the whole area is beset with this kind of chaos. And it's, yeah, the shift of the climate has meant that you've got populations moving kind of on top of each other. One group of people who may have always brought their herds through a certain area are now moving their herds through areas that are already populated. And of course, the people who live there are seeing their land sort of torn up by these movements, at the same time as which central governments are collapsing and they don't have the resources to kind of run the countries. And then you get the outsiders coming in. France historically was very dominant in that area, and one of the reasons was because there's a uranium mine in the middle of the Sahara, and the French needed that for their nuclear power stations. And the need for uranium globally is going up because of the shift away from hydrocarbon energy. So everything's connected. The French get kicked out, and the Russians have come in, and they've taken control of the same mine. So all these things are happening, are feeding the conflict, but it's all something to do with the climate crisis.
Yeah, so this thing that often, like, climate crises or climate conflict is seen as something that will happen or could happen, but it is already happening, and it's happening in many places. And one thing I really love about the work that you've been doing, I think sometimes when we think about the climate crisis, there's this, it's thought about in both like a dystopian and a utopian way, where it's absolute, so, well, you know, it's going to be a hellscape anyway, so why do anything? Or on the other side, the only way to change the world is to completely override capitalism and live in a new kind of socialist, meaningful utopia. And within that, actually, the variables of change and how we negotiate that are really important, because the reality is that we're going to be living, and our children are going to be living, with the realities of climate change. And as you mentioned, we're already in them now. So I really love that, both the immediacy of your work and also that longer view as well. There's like 4 themes you kind of organised your work around: earth, air, fire and water. I wonder if you could talk to why that elemental element.
Yeah, I mean, that was really, at the beginning, it was just something I did to help me organise my own thoughts, because it's such a big subject. I mean, in a way, I've put the pitch that everything is about it. Well, then try writing a book that isn't sort of 2,000 pages long, which, of course, no one would ever read. So I'd sort of grouped it that way. And obviously, these are the classical elements. The world isn't really made up of earth, air, fire and water, but we can all think our way around that. And it's quite interesting. Quite a lot of that world cultures have ended up sort of looking at the world in this way. I mean, it was, you know, it comes out of the sort of Greek philosophy, but you can look in other historic ancient cultures, and there are similar sort of analytical tools. So yeah, so if you think about it, Earth gives us food, but it also gives us the critical minerals that are a major part of this transition away from hydrocarbon energy. Air, the air that we breathe and the fact that it's getting hotter is at the heart of this crisis that we're dealing with. Fire, well, hydrocarbon energy is all about fire. It's about getting something out of the ground and setting fire to it. And finally, water. Water is essential to human life, but it's also very dangerous. And water and the way that water is both sustaining and killing people all over the world as a result of climate change is another massive factor. So those are the kind of the 4 blocks by which I sort of divided the book up.
Yeah, and I wondered that one of the, obviously, like Trump is very in the news as ever, and he's in this interesting place where almost accidentally or maybe instinctively, he seems to have stumbled upon one of the most defining issues of the future, which is the melting of the ice caps and the fact that the North Pole is going to become important for minerals, but also important for transport routes as well. I wondered if we could kind of bring those geopolitical shifts a little bit closer to home and locate it in some current political action. So is Trump a genius, or is he just accidentally stumbled across something there?
He's definitely not a genius. If you all breathe a sigh of relief. Otherwise, that would be the end. I think I'd have to leave in ignominious. I'm not sure this is a very pro-Trump audience, but
well,
anyway,
you should talk to Ember, because they've got some pretty funky views, that dog over there.
Well...
Yeah. The way they were barking at the other
If
dog.
I've offended anyone by not recognising the genius of the 47th president, I apologise. No, he's in the way that a stopped clock can be right. This may be what's happening with Trump. I think what is actually going on is that Trump is clearly someone who can be very easily manipulated, and we've seen this countless times. We've seen the way Putin plays him. I think it's very arguable that Netanyahu's played him a lot more recently. People play him, and clearly Trump's weird obsession with Greenland. There's various, I've seen reporting that there's this guy, Ronald Lauder, who's a big multi-billionaire. I think he's the Estee Lauder heir, that he was very obsessed with Greenland, and he sort of got Trump into it. I mean, it's quite interesting. If you think about, Donald Trump says that the climate crisis isn't real. It's a scam. Well, for someone who thinks it isn't real, he's very interested in getting hold of critical minerals that you need to deal with the climate crisis. So that's a bit confusing. But there is something, that a profound shift is happening, and this, in a way, the sort of core bit of the book is about this. That we are all living through this turning point in human history, which is the moment when we move from a hydrocarbon-based world economy to a renewable-based world economy. And of course, we've done it too late, we're doing it too slowly. Those of us have children, grandchildren, or whatever, we may wish we'd got further, but that is happening. Now, hydrocarbon power has been the power of the 20th and 21st century. The world's most powerful countries, particularly America, depend on the fact that they control hydrocarbon resources, both within their own country, but also in places like the Middle East. And it is the ending of that era, which I would argue explains quite a lot of the behavior that we're seeing, including, I think, the war in Iran, where you are looking, the Gulf countries have got, 20, 30 years left? And they're trying to shift their business model. When I say left, they're not going to run out of oil. We're just going to not need it very much anymore. In fact, the global demand for hydrocarbons is just about peaking right now. So again, it's all happened too slowly, but it has happened. If you are running a Gulf petrostate, imagine you might be in your 30s, you're an absolute ruler of a Gulf petrostate, and it's a monarchy, so you're going to still be the ruler 60 years from now. Your name might be Mohammed bin Salman. You know that you're still going to be running this country when it has a population nearly double the size it has now, and the basis of your economy has collapsed. That causes people to behave in desperate and unpredictable ways.
So in that sense, you feel like some of the more, the wilder policy decisions being made in the Middle East, and Iran, of course, Iran's not quite in the Middle East, is almost, it's what? It's a kind of It's the last flungs of power. It's scrambling around for solutions. It's what is precisely, do you think?
So I mean, let's look. There are various things happening here, but let's talk for a bit about Dubai. So Dubai is the only Gulf. It's not a country. It's a emirate within a state, but it behaves like a country. The only Gulf country that has a post-oil economy. It has tourism. It has banking. It has property. It has ridiculous influencers, whatever. Sorry, any influencers here? I've offended the Trump people. Now
we've invited them here, Arthur.
Yeah, right.
They're precisely the people we shouldn't have.
I've got my checklist of people I'm planning to piss off. So just working through. Anyway, so apologies to the influencers. And so they have this business model. It's kind of working. Well, it works until a war begins. Until you don't feel very influential when you've got a drone flying through your funky apartment or whatever. But that is the economic model that the Gulf countries are trying to shift to. Look at what Qatar did hosting the World Cup. Look at the fact that Saudi Arabia is trying to develop its tourism industry and this NEOM, which they've kind of given up on, but they had these ideas to create this massive city up in the desert. They're all doing that because they're trying to build for a post-oil future. But the only way that they can do that is if they can sell as much oil and gas as possible for the next 2 or 3 decades. And any kind of security problem that attacks the oil and gas markets is a nightmare for them. So if you look particularly, this is why they're all terrified of Iran, because Iran, whilst actually having a military budget that is a fraction of the size of all of the Gulf countries, does actually have the military capability to completely destabilize the region and, as we've seen, block the Straits of Hormuz. So this is this kind of nightmare scenario unfolding.
Yeah, and the fragility of the what you might call the global order or just globalized transport and politics, and how that can both be disrupted by fiery political decisions or people who aren't geniuses in the White House, has really been illuminated. And I suppose I just want to dig down. Do you therefore envisage more chaos? Because it seems to be what you're saying is, from a climate perspective, what we need to do is transition much quicker, but actually that's accelerating oil consumption at the moment. You have a hope that at some point that will curve off, but before we get there, you're almost seems like you're predicting a moment of political chaos and deep intensity and upheaval because we're reaching the ends of the dying embers of a particular system, and that rampant change is happening so quickly compared to other historical moments.
Yeah, I think that's right. So it's the acceleration point is so important that something that might, in another context, have occurred over a century is happening over a small number of years, probably a couple of decades. I think we are braced for that. And of course, part of it, I talk a lot about climate change, but we have to talk about individuals. In the end, the fact that you have a political leadership in America which is sort of acknowledging the existence of the climate crisis in its behavior around Greenland and critical minerals, but is doing nothing. And of course, Trump has been cancelling renewable energy projects back home and effectively completely leaning in to the petrochemical industry. I assume it's because he's ultimately economically incentivized to do so. But at the same time, we haven't yet talked about China. So China has completely dominated this transition. China will become the great sort of electric superpower. And of course, that in itself just emphasizes the decline of America. And what do declining empires tend to do? They tend to start wars because they want to cling on to their power.
Yeah, and wars as a sign of fragility rather than strength. I wonder if we could talk about some of the other winners from this kind of geopolitical shifts, these changing winds, or maybe that's too passive a phrase, these kind of engineered crises. Russia may well be a winner from it, because you make the point that northern Russia, which is currently freezing, may well become like fertile land. And actually, one of the big consequences of these shifts is huge migrations of people, and to some quite surprising areas. So one of the things I think you mentioned is a migration from China to northern Russia, perhaps?
Yeah, and the Russia thing is I accept, probably a bit controversial, not least because lots of people, myself included, feel very strongly about what Russia's done in Ukraine. I take no pleasure in an analytical conclusion that Russia actually sees quite a lot of upside. But obviously, if you look at a map of the world, the huge northern landmass is Russian, and it's basically unpopulated. Russia's population is not huge, and it is declining. And particularly Russia's Far East. it is an area of just almost unbelievable emptiness. The number of people that live there, given the space, is quite bizarre. What makes it particularly bizarre is it is just to the north of a part of China that has hundreds of millions of people living in it. I'm talking about the North Chinese Plain, which under most fairly conservative estimates of likely climate change, becomes a very hard place to live by the middle of this century, because it's not just heat, but extreme humidity, and that's what kills people. Now, it's not just the fact that Russia's a bit colder and a bit norther. There's more to it than that. The fact is that this far eastern part of Russia is historically seen by the Chinese as their territory. So back in the 1860s, at a time when you had European colonial powers seizing bits of China, and a period which Chinese people look back as a period of humiliation of China in historic terms, the Russians, along with the British and the French and others, were involved in that, and they seized this huge area of territory that we now think of. Vladivostok was a Chinese city called Haishenwai. And so on official Chinese maps from 2023 onwards, it's been marked in some of these maps as Chinese territory. Now, I don't think China would ever want to try to invade, not least because we're talking about nuclear-armed powers. They tend not to go to war with one another. But let's think about the fact that I'm talking about Russia benefiting geographically, but as a state, it's very weak. And it's completely dependent on the hydrocarbon sector. And Russia has become very, very dependent on China, particularly post the Ukraine war. So it has to sell its hydrocarbons to the Chinese because of the sanctions in the West. So you've got the situation where Russia is very dependent on China, very dependent economically, increasingly politically dominated by China. And then you're seeing already Chinese citizens moving into that far east of Russia, where actually areas are opening up for farmland, which used to be basically uninhabitable because it's so cold. And that's a shift that's just ongoing. So I think we can expect that to accelerate.
And I think migration is obviously such a hot topic at the moment politically, and a very spicy political football. But one thing I suppose that is really going to be impacted by climate crisis. And coming back to your point, I think this idea of what can we do now? Maybe at the moment we're accelerating, or certain companies, or certain countries rather, have an invested interest, and companies, in fossil fuel use before it becomes untenable. But in that moment means that we're going to have percentage point rises that are going to be very, very impactful. So coming back to this thing of we need to think about the climate future with nuance, because it's not going to entirely be a hellscape. It may well have elements of extreme dystopia, but neither is it going to probably be solved by any form of utopian overpouring of the system. So it needs to negotiate what are these nuances going to be. And I love the Davis Wallace Wells book, who makes the point, percentage point rises in climate make huge changes to migration patterns. So something like 0.2% rise by 2055 is the difference between 200 and 500 million climate refugees from the Middle East. So we're going to have to deal with, no matter what happens, very extreme levels of migration. They're going to be mitigated by, if we're able to kind of radically reduce climate change now. So I wonder if you could talk to that. What impacts and what the flows of migration are going to be, and how you think they're going to be responded to by political systems in the West that are very sensitive to that. Sorry, huge question, but there you go.
Which I will answer in 3 seconds. No, no. I mean, obviously migration has become a very toxic, divisive subject in politics, and that's now, and it is only going to become more so in scale, as far as I can see. So, as you rightly note, the climate creates climate refugees. It's already doing so, and it creates more and more of them. So I spoke, for example, we talk a lot about Europe, and perhaps just a step away, let's talk about North America, where you have the shifting climate in Central America, places where, particularly in the highland regions of Central America, which used to be quite good farming areas, affected by extreme droughts, and then you get these extreme weather events. So you'll have a period of drought, and then you'll have a year's rainfall in a week, and it's impossible to operate in those kinds of conditions. People inevitably are trying to migrate northwards. Now, we also know that, for example, Donald Trump's political movement was built, day one, he was going on about Mexicans. So his whole political sort of trajectory has been about building that wall. And at the moment, they've succeeded, if you can call it a success, in limiting migration across the southern border of the United States. Well, it doesn't answer any of the things that, of course, are the pull factors for migration, like the fact that they need workers in their economy and they have an aging population and so on and so forth. But we are going to see millions of people moving, and it feeds into a kind of zero-sum populist politics. And what's interesting about that is that actually climate denial in politics is almost always a populist thing. So you'll see it here. Nigel Farage, he flirts with it. He hasn't sort of gone all in, I think, because he knows that within the British context, most people are not climate deniers. Most people accept the obvious science. In America, you can be much more forceful, because America is, in fact, the only country on Earth where a significant proportion of the population don't believe in the climate crisis, which is going to be quite ironic for people in Miami in a few years' time. But anyway, we'll worry about that later. But this point about migration, I think it's very strange, because you can have conversations. I mean, I spoke to literally probably the most senior person in the entire United Nations dealing with migration. And you know, she's, as you might expect, quite well informed on this subject. She says she doesn't really understand where Western governments are going, because there's a single trajectory, which is politicians, even on the supposedly liberal side of the argument, becoming more and more hardline on migration, at the same time as which you have these migratory pressures, which are ever increasing, but also fundamental economic and demographic pressures, aging populations, a need to finance pensions, all the rest of it, which means that we need migrants. So something's going to give, and we don't yet know what.
Yeah, and at the same time, we're massively cutting aid budgets and funding defense budgets. So it's like, and eventually that problem is going to end up on your doorstep. So it's hard to not envisage a future, and maybe you can give us the ingredients to swerve this future. One in which the political calculation is, or the thing that populists do that ends up pushing lots of politics to populism, is to do nothing to solve the problem, make the problem worse, and then exploit it politically. So things get nastier and the problem gets exasperated. So rather than solutions and progression, we end up with doubling down on the problem and doubling down on that being weaponized for politics.
Right. So, I mean,
cheers.
My book.
Happy Sunday, everyone.
Yeah, my book is not a doomsday book, and this is a laid back Sunday afternoon. So let's not go full over the edge. I mean, I think a couple of things. Something of great importance is happening today in Europe, which is the Hungarian election, which it looks quite possible Viktor Orban will lose. And one of the things that are populist is they're crap at government, and Orban has managed to cling on longer than most because he's rigged the system, but even with all the rigging, he's still probably going to lose. I mean, if he doesn't lose, I apologise. But anyway, all the polls are pointing to that. So I think that's one thing. Another thing to remember is actually that most migrants don't move country, or they might move to a neighbouring country. They don't move across continents. You know, it's that old thing that what we might see here, particularly Britain being, the far northwest of Europe, is a tiny fraction, of course, of what is migrating, of the numbers migrating. Now, that may, some people in this room might think we should get more migrants and have a positive view. I personally think that myself. But in terms of just the brutal facts of it, most people are not going to come to Europe. Most people are not going to go to North America. But I think coming back to the, will politicians have a moment of realism? I think we do sometimes have to go through these cycles of electing governments that do stupid things.
Yeah. How long do the cycles last? That's the question. Yeah, I mean, there's so many places to go to talk to about this. I mean, maybe because we'll go to audience questions shortly, so if you have any, do let them percolate. Maybe a thing to think about, because of you've been in the Foreign Office, and I think you've had experience working closely with American and European allies, America and Helmand, I think. What do you think what are the new political alliances that are going to come out of these shifting kind of climate changes? We're perhaps already seeing them, these convulsions in NATO, Trump obviously, not to mention him again, but always threatening to pull out of it. But from that, perhaps a new politics and emerging in solidarity in Europe, and a realization that those ties need to be stronger. And then there are other global alliances emerging as well. So I wondered, how do you think those kind of remnants of post-World War, Cold War era might evolve into something else in this new world?
Yeah, I mean, I think if we look at Europe, actually, we are seeing already a re-engagement of the UK and Europe. Obviously, it's a big topic, and there's the politics of it, and people talk about whether we could rejoin the single market or the EU eventually, all that stuff. But putting all that on one side, let's just talk about energy and renewable energy. So already the UK is much more integrated into a cross-European electricity grid than ever before, and all the plans are to increase that. And there's basic reasons for that renewable energy works best when you can shunt it around, basically, because the wind might be blowing here and not in Germany, or vice versa. So there's an enormous amount of interconnectors now that cross the North Sea and the English Channel. Now, if we zoom the lens out at a more global level, all this is happening, of course, at the same time as the US is sort of digging its heels in on this obsession with hydrocarbon energy, but also at the same time, as you rightly note, Trump and the MAGA movement, they don't really want to have anything to do with Europe. I mean, I personally think I speak as a diplomat who's attended the NATO headquarters and all the rest of it. I think NATO is done. I mean, who here believes that the US Marine Corps would deploy to Latvia to defend the Latvians? I mean, if you do, I admire your optimism. Sorry, but Latvia, just a random example, and I've got nothing against Latvia. But, that's the thing. Do we really think they would do that? Of course they wouldn't. So NATO...
You're that certain about that?
Yeah.
Really?
Why would they do that?
Because they're in NATO.
But they don't... I mean, Donald Trump thinks that NATO is, dare I say it, like a little dog that he can summon, but actually it's one of those dogs that looks at you and goes, no, I don't feel like...
Well, I think, and there's been this theme in our conversation about things getting more violent towards the end, getting more violent as climate change accelerates and as one era ends and a new one begins. And that's what I think, on a kind of more short-term level, not to end on another depressing note, is well, as Trump reaches this, he may well become a lame duck president if the midterms go the way they think they're going to go. In that may be for Putin, I've only got 2 more years of Trump, I need to now test NATO's resolve. There's a window there within the next 2 years that could really be tested and things could really change in Europe. And I'm going to go to audience questions after that. Yes.
Yeah, I mean, I think, again, one can look at that and feel very depressed and low about it, but or we can recall the fact that actually Europe's ability to stand together on defence has been transformed since the 2022 invasion of Ukraine. And if you think about, Finland joining NATO, I mean, basically, if you'd reversed the thing and Finland had joined NATO and then Russia had invaded Ukraine, you might say, you want to defend it, because I can understand, because Finland is such a big country geographically, very militarily strong. The Russians would lose their shit if they joined NATO. Well, they did join NATO, and the Russians couldn't do anything about it. So, and obviously Sweden as well. Again, these are 2 very important countries in European defence terms. So the fact that they have joined NATO, the fact that Europe is taking a lot more seriousness, there is every day a new European defence company is being set up. The fact that the Ukrainians have created an entire way of fighting war with drones that didn't exist before, that has already been shown to be arguably much more effective than the sort of old-school Patriot missiles NATO model, which we've relied on hitherto. Obviously, I'm not saying we shouldn't worry if the Russians... No, that's something we should all worry about. But I actually think that Europe has a lot more resilience than we really realise.
Do we have any audience questions? Yes, we've got one over here, we've got one over the back and one at the front. So, yeah.